For those of you I don't know, my name is Joan Gable, and I'm the Dean of the Robert J. Trulaske Senior College of Business. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to our distinguished alumni lecture. Before we begin, I'd like to ask that you turn off your cell phones and put them away, and I'm going to pause and give you a moment to do that. And while you're doing that, I'd like to remind you to please stay until the completion of the program, which includes the Q&A. And during that segment, I really encourage you to ask questions. You have a speaker today who's very candid in answering questions, and you have a wonderful opportunity to learn something new if you take advantage of it. One of the strategic priorities of the Trulaske College of Business is the collaboration between industry experts and you all as our students, which helps us better equip you for success when you graduate. Our business partners serve a really important role in this preparation and in your readiness for the real world by providing you with things like knowledge about trends, issues, and practices, how to turn challenges into opportunities, words of wisdom, war stories, examples, and some of our speakers, like today's, go above and beyond to bring you access here and abroad to the best lessons available from the corporate experience. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Mr. Ed Rapp, who earned his BSBA with an emphasis in finance from the University of Missouri in 1979. Mr. Rapp is a group president and CFO of Caterpillar, Inc., a Fortune 500 manufacturer of heavy machinery and engines based nearby in Peoria, Illinois. With 2010 sales and revenues of more than $42 billion, Caterpillar is one of the world's leading producers of construction and mining equipment, diesel and natural gas engines, industrial gas turbines, and diesel-electric locomotives. Mr. Rapp started his career with Caterpillar as a pricing analyst, and since then has held a variety of management positions throughout the world for the manufacturing giant. He was named a Caterpillar officer in 2000, acting as vice president of the Europe, Africa, Middle East Marketing Division. Mr. Rapp stepped into his present position in 2007. He currently is responsible for the Financial Services, Human Services, Global Purchasing and Financial Products divisions, as well as Global Information Services, Strategy and Business Development, Corporate Auditing, and Investor Relations. In addition to his work with Caterpillar, Mr. Rapp is a member of the Trulaske College of Business Strategic Development Board and helps the college and me provide excellent educational opportunities in many ways. Some examples include Mr. Rapp's service as college professor for a day, his vital role in arranging a Cornell Leadership Program visit to Santiago, Chile, to study South American business practices, helping our study abroad students in China have a visit, and serving as a commencement speaker last year. He received the college's Citation of Merit in 2010. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Ed Rapp.
Thank you very much, Dean Gable. It's great to be back. If it's okay with you, I'll probably roam a little bit instead of behind the podium. I apologize for the guy with the camera here. I might make it a little bit more difficult. This is actually my third time back. And, the first time I came, they said, please don't come with a standard, this is what I do in the corporate world type of presentation. And so, actually, the first time I talked about positive leadership in what can be a negative world. And maybe when we have to dust off here. The second time I talked about managing through financial crisis. It's another one that we may get a chance to replay here if we don't manage things globally. And the one I really wanted to talk about today is this issue of U.S. competitiveness. And my intent is to kind of try to strike a balance between making you a bit uncomfortable but also kind of stirring your competitive spirit. Because as I get into the case later, I'd like to make the point that if we don't address some of the issues relative to our competitiveness, we're setting ourselves up for a path that I don't think we want to take. Before we get into that, Dean Gable did a good job of providing my career, if you would, at Caterpillar. Kind of a simple definition of who I am is really only 4 bullets, and it really describes really who I am. And number 1 is Pilot Grove. I've had the great fortune. I've lived in San Francisco, California, Johannesburg, South Africa, Geneva, Switzerland, Raleigh, North Carolina. And there isn't a talk I give on leadership when I don't reference the fact that I proudly hail from Pilot Grove, Missouri. I don't care where you go, what you do, how important you may think you are. The one thing I absolutely believe, and it comes from the foundation that my family gave me, is you never forget where you come from. And I never want to forget that. Another part of that, not forgetting, is Mizzou. I'm back here because of what the education from this great institution has done for me. It changed my life. And I sat where you sat today. Well, actually, I was over in Middlebush. Facilities weren't near as nice. But you just never underestimate the power of an education and what it can do for you. The next one on See the World, my senior year, a guy from CAT shows up and he's recruiting, and I, just like you guys do when you go through, you're doing the research on the company, and I was looking at the map of the world in the back of the Caterpillar annual report, and it showed all of the operations around the world. And I said to the guy, if you work at a company like Caterpillar, is it really possible to experience the globe? And I've used his quote 1,000 times. He said, young man, Caterpillar is a company, if you work hard and apply yourself, you can see the world and get paid to do it. And that's exactly what I've been doing for the last 32 years. And then the last bullet point is family. While I take great pride in what I've accomplished in the professional part of my life, trust me, it pales in comparison by the pride I take in what my wife Ann and I have achieved in our personal life. My only failing was 3 kids, and none of them went to the University of Missouri. But when you move kids around the world, you teach them the concept of independence. Sometimes they play that back on you. But that's for another day. The other one on the picture is, I use this in leadership presentations as a constant reminder. Today I'll talk about elements of leadership I've learned from great leaders throughout my career. But when it comes to that topic of leadership, I'm still growing into the shoes of what it takes to be a great leader. And I learn every day. And that's one of the things I like about coming back on campus. I learn from every interaction. I have the great fortune on the development board. And so it's absolutely a pleasure to be here. Well, I'm going to talk about competitiveness. It is time for a brief commercial break in terms of Caterpillar. Who we are. I describe it this way. One, we're the leader in our industry, more than twice the size of our nearest competitor, and that's the way we want it. We never take that leadership position for granted. We know we got to earn it each and every day by bringing greater value to our customers than any of our competitors do. Global, we touch literally every part of the world. Students going to Chile, not a problem. We can get you hooked up, and I think you guys had a good visit. Other group going to China, yep, we got 10,000 employees, 15 factories there. We can have a good discussion. But it's that global part of the company that attracted me. And as we see today, the build-out of that global network is becoming even more prevalent based on where economic development and growth is happening. Number 3 is seed, grow, harvest. Caterpillar's made up of a bunch of Midwesterners. If you look at our leadership, in fact, 2 of the group presidents, 2 of the 5 group presidents at Caterpillar are products of the University of Missouri. One from Columbia, me, and another guy named Steve Wanning from Raleigh. The reality of it is somebody sitting in this room probably is going to be giving this pitch down the road. But we talk about seed, grow, harvest as a strategy because we seed it by developing the best products in the world. We grow it by having market leadership. We like to have strong market share versus our competitors. And then harvest is we want to look after that product and harvest the product support and the services that come with it. And that's really the business model that built Caterpillar dating back to 1925. It's just who we are. Next, we're a free trader. We have promoted the concept of free trade from the foundation. Caterpillar was started in 1925. One of the things that I have in my office back in Peoria that I take great pride in is a copy of our first annual report. 1925, we had $20 million in sales, and those $20 million in sales had exports to 29 different countries of the world in 1925. In 1929, 25% of our corporate sales actually went to Russia. The U.S. was heading into the Great Depression, and Russia was building out their farm co-op system. And so we've believed in free trade from the very beginning, the foundation, if you would, of the company. And then lastly is no free rein. We have a fundamental belief as a company that you give no competitor free rein in his home country. The best way to be a great U.S. company is to compete on a global basis. So we've been in Brazil since the 1950s. We went into Europe right after World War II, Japan in 1962. We went into China the year after Nixon's visit, and we've been in Russia as a manufacturer for over 25 years now. Because if you want to compete and win on a global scale, you compete everywhere. And that's one of the things that's been at the foundation of who we are as a company. You may see our products around town. You go all the way from a skid steer loader down here on the left that you may see doing a landscaping job in a local community here, all the way to our 797 truck. That 797 truck has a payload. We'll carry 400 tons at one time. That skid steer, you can buy 2 skid steers for the cost of one of the tires. That 797 goes for about $5 million. And if you want one, you're going to have to wait. First availability right now is first quarter 2013 because of the strong global demand that we're seeing based on mining. The Dean talked about 2010 sales of $42 billion. If you think of all the negative noise you hear in the papers today relative to global economies and everything else, I'm sure you're under the impression that we continue to struggle under that pressure. The current midpoint of our outlook for 2011 is $55 billion because we compete around the world. We also are big into the engine business, all the way from a small engine that you can use as a generator or a backup generator at your house, all the way up to our large 3600 that will power at 6,500 horsepower ocean-going vessels. And we always thought we had big equipment until we just completed the acquisition of Bucyrus. About an $8.8 billion acquisition. This hydraulic rope shovel will load that truck, 400 tons, in 3 passes, 3 bucket loads in 90 seconds. This is fun stuff to work on. I get to go to work every day, all right? But, it's not about the yellow iron. For me, at CAT, we truly believe it's not what we make that really matters. We do honestly believe it's what we make possible. There was an old-timer at CAT years ago that coined the phrase, the road to progress begins with a road, period. And, I've experienced it. Having lived and traveled throughout Africa, I've seen what basic infrastructure does to the development of a society. You cannot advance as a society to a higher standard of living without the basics of infrastructure, roads, sewers, water, electricity. And as you build out that basic infrastructure, it really gives people the opportunity to move to a higher standard of living. And we're seeing that play out in spades today in the likes of India, China, and other parts of the developing world, okay? So, one of the things that you'll have the opportunity to do when you leave this great institution is to find the kind of company that you have a passion for, and at least for me, this is the passion that's driven me at CAT from the very beginning. Let's shift to the concept of competitiveness. Now, when you've been gone for 32 years, it was really sad. I was at the country club in Peoria earlier this year. I had my Titleist hat with the Mizzou emblem on the side. And the young kid in the caddy shack, he says, "Oh, do you go to Mizzou?" Well, I don't go to Mizzou now, yeah. And I said, "Yeah, I'm a proud graduate of the class of 1979." And he says, "I'm part of the class of 2016. I'm going to be a freshman." Think of it, 2016, give me a break, But I figured that as you come to an environment like this, you have to communicate in ways that perhaps the student body is used to communicating. So what I want to do is I want to set up what's changed in the competitive world in my time, from when I left here to what it's like in competing today. And I figured, since I spent a little time in Africa, I'd draw on that African experience to give you a view of it. So if you think about kind of where it was back in 1979 when I left here, the world wasn't all that competitive. I mean, at CAT, I used to get a cost of living adjustment every quarter. I remember after I'd been there a quarter, I looked at my paycheck and it went up, and I thought, I got a raise. And you're probably so young you don't know what a cost of living adjustment is. Back in those days, inflation was high, and quarterly, you just got a little more money. You know, I worked in the pricing area early in my career. We used to take a price increase the first Monday of every quarter, and by the Wednesday, all of our major competitors had already followed, most of them US-based. And this video tries to capture kind of the way life was back then. You showed up to work, the orders came in, you know, and life was pretty easy. But along the way, trust me, it's changed. And there's a room full of people just like this in Beijing, Shanghai, Chennai, that want our jobs, want our customers. We've got major competitors coming out of Japan. Komatsu is one of our really strong global competitors. We have emerging competitors coming out of China. You'll hear the names Lugong, Sunny, that are looking not only to compete with us in China, but also expand globally. And we even have strong competitors domestically who've taken their line of sight and want to compete with us. I don't know if any of you had a chance to watch 60 Minutes on Sunday night. There was actually a video clip on there of Jeff Immelt, who's the CEO of GE. And they had a video of him stirring up his employees, and in it he said, I want you to wake up every morning thinking about how you can beat Caterpillar. I hate the color yellow. And we take that as a huge compliment, that people want to compete with us because the world has changed. And this next video is really intended to give you a feel for how it feels in today's competitive world. You work hard, you're chasing down your competition, you think you're just about there. And somebody comes along and they move the cheese. Now, while this is intended to be a little lighthearted, it is also a little bit of the reflection of the way it really works. If you don't adapt, if you don't change, you're going to get left behind. In fact, if you look at evolution, it isn't the smartest that survives, it isn't the strongest, but the one that learns to adapt. And I really want to now talk about, from a competitive perspective, are we adapting to the global environment that we're operating in today? Now, there's probably one thing that I have in common with every person in the audience today. Collectively, we hate KU. I flew in from Europe last Saturday. I landed, was going through security. My phone rings, and it's a friend of mine from K-State. And my response was, oh, we lost. Because he wasn't going to call me if they won. But the reality of it is, K-State or KU makes Missouri a better school, a better football team, a better basketball team, whatever it may be. Because competition is a good thing. It's what stirs us as a company, and I think it's what stirs the competitive spirit of the school. But the question is are we taking that same view of how we look at U.S. competitiveness? How much of the debate today is Republican versus Democrat versus the U.S. competing with the likes of China, Japan, Germany, Brazil, or others? I mean, it's not a question of how we debate or compete with one another. In fact, I'd argue it's not a question of how you're going to compete in the workforce, even with people from KU or Iowa State. It's how are you going to stack up and compete with the kids coming out of the schools in China, India. I mean, your job's going to be much tougher than mine. Because when I graduated, that part of the world was kind of shut off. I tell you, they're not shut off anymore. But as a country, have we lost our competitive edge? I'm going to take you through some indicators where I think it says it's being called into question. First up, in terms of kind of the news, this whole debate about the debt ceiling, would just dominate the news. One of the things by traveling globally, you not only get a view of the U.S. from a U.S. perspective, but you also see how this plays out around the world. And I'll tell you, I found it a bit embarrassing. The concepts that we let things get pushed to the end, to the limit, like we did. But I'm not here to talk about the cost side of the equation. Now, we've got to get our fiscal house in order. We've got a lot of waste that we know we can eliminate. And we've got to get a 10-year plan that makes sense in terms of that happening. But one of the things you'll find out as you get into the business world, you cannot cost cut yourself to success. If in running a business you do not have a growth element, if you don't have a strategy to improve your competitiveness, to grow your business, you're going to go nowhere. And so I really want to talk about is what does it take to get the growth side of this country and our economy really stirred? And I want to build it around 4 areas. Do we have a tax system that is competitive with the rest of the world? Capital is mobile today, can move anywhere. Do we have a system that attracts capital to be invested in this country or not? Trade. Are we as engaged in the area of free trade and competing around the world to the degree that we should be? Infrastructure. Does our infrastructure support what it takes to be globally competitive today? And last, and most importantly, is where do we stand in the area of education, which I would argue is, for any country, is the only sustainable competitive advantage. And like I said, a lot of people today want to debate these issues in isolation. What I want to try to do with you is put it in a package and really relate it back to where do we stand regarding U.S. competitiveness. Let's start with the issue of tax. Now, first up, you may say, well, okay, it's a typical corporate speak. You guys are coming and asking for special favors and tax breaks. Earlier this year, I had the opportunity to testify before the Ways and Means Committee. I spent 3 hours, the full membership, questions about corporate tax competitiveness. And one of the things they said is that you're just in here asking for special favors, special provisions. And my response was absolutely not. All we want is a level playing field. I mean, you just give us the corporate tax structure that the other OECD countries have, and then at the end of the day, it's our job to go out and compete and win in the marketplace. Just give us a level playing field. But what's happened relative to our global competitiveness in our tax structure over the last number of years? As you can see, that playing field has gotten skewed. The last time we had major tax reform in the U.S. was 1986. It was led by Ronald Reagan. And at that point in time, it put the U.S. in a competitive position. Since 1986, though, the other OECD countries have done 2 things. They've lowered their weighted average corporate tax rate by 19 percentage points, and they've moved to a territorial system. Now, I'm at the business school, so I'm going to assume when I talk about territorial versus worldwide tax, repatriation, this is stuff that you guys are familiar with. Right? I mean, a territorial system is one where if you make money in one country, you pay tax in that country. That's what virtually every other country in the world has done. Worldwide system that we have today, if we make money, build product, sell product, and make profit in China, and we bring that money back to the U.S., we will pay incremental tax when we bring it back to the U.S. And that's why today it's estimated that there's $1 trillion trapped offshore of U.S. companies not bringing money back here because we've got an antiquated worldwide tax system versus moving to what the rest of the world has done. You know, as we look at it, first of all, it's got to be simple. Caterpillar's 2010 tax return is 4,600 pages. That's our U.S. tax return. It's got to be territorial. You know, there was a point in time in the 1950s when the U.S. accounted for 50% of global GDP. You know, we could write the rules. Today, we're less than 20% of global GDP. We have to figure out what it takes to compete. It's got to be competitive, and then lastly, it's got to be predictable. You know, in business like us, you make major investment decisions based on your understanding of where it's going to be over the long term. We cannot have changes year to year, month to month in terms of U.S. taxes. For example, the R&D tax credit has been expended 14 times in the last 30 years. We've got to get to a point where we're competitive, predictable, and that will help drive investment and help improve competitiveness. So number one, let's get ourselves competitive in the area of tax. Second one is trade. The reality of the situation is 5% of the world population is what the U.S. represents. So if you want to be a global leader, can you do that by putting walls up around your country? You know, when the stimulus package was originally launched, it had language in there that promoted Buy American. I was in a session like this with a group of employees, you know, in the Peoria area, and I asked them, is that Buy American provision a good thing or a bad thing? You know, they kind of were suspicious as to why I was asking the question, and so they kind of sat there and thought about it for a while, and then a young man raised his hand and said, I think it's probably a good thing. And, you know, 8 out of the 10 tractors that we build in our East Peoria plant go export. Because 95% of the world population lives outside the U.S. And I think we just, you know, got to accept the fact that if we're going to be the global leader, we're going to have to play on a global stage and really promote the concepts of free trade. The U.S. for decades, I mean decades, led this discussion. And if you look at history, it will tell you that it's led to global growth. This goes back to 1900 to 2000, in periods of when people were focused on trade liberalization and global growth versus trade wars, or periods that we're in now where there's trade friction. Free movement of goods and services around the world lifts growth globally. And people say, what do you get worried about today? Yeah, I'm worried about Greece, and yeah, I'm worried about what's going on here in terms of getting a long-term budget, you know, in place. What I worry about most, if people start closing up the borders, because that's going to lead to slow growth, and it's going to lead to a lot of friction. Now, sometimes people say, well, yeah, but if you sign these free trade agreements, we export jobs. The reality of the situation is quite different. What this looks at is the U.S. trade balance in 2010. The green areas show where we got surplus. You can see surpluses in areas like services. That's like computers, IBM, it's Google, Apple, you know, financial services, where we have large trade surpluses. If you come down to agriculture, one of the true stinks of the U.S. is our agricultural trade surpluses. But the next category is the key one, manufactured goods, 17 free trade agreements. We as a country have free trade agreements with 17 countries, and we have a trade surplus in our trade with those 17 countries. The deficit that you hear about is driven by two factors. One, the lack of a good clarity on an energy policy, that's oil. But the second one is, in the bottom, the gap we have on manufactured goods on countries that we do not have free trade agreements with. If we want to grow as a country, we've got to engage in that discussion and expand the free trade agreements. Last night was a pretty historical night in this area. How many of you are aware of the fact that we finally passed the free trade agreements with Colombia, Panama, and Korea last night? Okay? This has been 4 years in the making. An absolute no-brainer in terms of should have happened a long time ago. But you know, that should only be the starting point for us as we need to engage. And to help make it real, you remember the large off-highway truck I talked about earlier? Our number 9th largest export market for us, Caterpillar, is Colombia. Large mining opportunity. We've been paying, over that 4-year period we've been debating this, 15% duty or $300,000 a truck. With the trade agreement, that duty goes away, and that $300,000 gets redeployed back in the business, making more competitive, poured into R&D, capacity expansion, improved market position, whatever it may be. We have got to get back to this issue of we compete globally, we promote free trade, and as a country we lead on it if we want to maintain U.S. competitiveness. The next step is you get competitive taxes and you get trade agreements that really do encourage you to compete on a global scale. You got to have infrastructure to flow it across. Now, how many of you think our infrastructure is in good shape today? I mean, just go out. If you do, I'll give you a half an hour to go up and drive up and down, Interstate 70. And you've all seen the articles in terms of the state of the U.S. Infrastructure. From 1980 till 2010, the usage of our U.S. highway system has increased 95%, yet our capacity has only increased 7%. And you see it play out. Traffic, you probably don't want to go to Kansas City or St. Louis during the busy time. You experience flight delays when you fly through airports. Our infrastructure in many ways is in a state of disrepair. I started traveling overseas with Caterpillar in 1982. And in those early days, you could feel the difference relative to U.S. infrastructure. I mean, you left great roads, great airports, and you landed into some tough parts of the world. I tell you, today, when you travel overseas, you feel the difference in infrastructure and how far we have to go. Now, this is a pure function of willingness to invest. This goes back to 1930 to 2010. When you've been around since 1925, you got a lot of old records, okay? But if you go back to 1930, and if you look at 30 through 1970, the red line's GDP, the black line's investment in infrastructure. And as you can see, for that period of time, they ran in parallel, which makes sense. You invest in infrastructure, you grow GDP. But starting in 1970, we decided not to invest in infrastructure. And for this period of time, from 1970 to 2010, you can see GDP growth and infrastructure investment at half of it. Independent studies, not somebody who's out here selling tractors, say that we've underinvested to the tune of $2 trillion. And you say, well, infrastructure, yeah, but if you look at it, GDP growth has continued. If you look at the U.S., GDP growth, 1929 to 69, averaged 4.4%. If you look at 70 through 2010, it averaged 3%. But if you just take the last 10 years, 2000 to 2010, the average GDP growth rate in the U.S. was 1.6%. The lowest 10-year period dating back to the 40s and periods of war. If you don't invest in competitiveness, including infrastructure, you lose growth. With the infrastructure we've got in place today, it's one of the risks that absolutely exist. And then lastly, you get into the issue of how do we compare with the rest of the world. When I was in the Ways and Means Committee and talking about infrastructure, one of the congressmen said, Ed, I think you're overplaying it. Our infrastructure isn't in that bad a shape. And I told him, if you fly through Shanghai, Beijing, and Dubai, back into Washington, Dulles, the first question you're going to ask yourself is, which one is the developing country? But taking care of tax and trade and infrastructure is only part of the equation. The long-term sustainable advantage comes from education. It wasn't that many years ago that the U.S. was number 1 in the world on the proportion of its population that were college graduates. Today we rank number 5. And the number is static, 42%. And for generations, the generation that came after, went to college, greater portion of them went to college, but we've been stagnant in the area of education. And if you look at some of the numbers today amongst youth, it really does get alarming. These are the statistics on 15-year-olds by the Program for International Student Assessment, and it shows the rankings on math, science, and reading between China, Japan, Germany, and the U.S. That's where we rank. If indeed education is your only sustainable long-term competitive advantage and you have those rankings, does it give you the sense that we're ready to compete and win? Now for us, it's not only an issue of engineers, accountants, finance. It's also the people that work in our factories. Because about half of our employment are people who build our tractors, who repair our tractors. Service technicians right now, we have over 9% unemployment in the U.S. today, and most of our dealers cannot hire service technicians. U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics says that there are 3 million jobs today that can't be filled because of lack of basic skills. Now, some people want to say, okay, this is just a question of money. We need to spend more money on education. The reality of it is the U.S. spends a higher amount of money per capita than any other country in the world. We're going to have to get after reform in our educational systems to make sure we're feeding great institutions like this with the kind of talent that it takes to compete long term. Now, you can ask yourself the question, maybe I buy into a little bit of this, but this is the U.S. We got a great history. Can't we just rest on our laurels a bit? Now, I think history would tell you it's not really a very good solution. There's been great empires like the Roman Empire. I don't think today that plays out as one of the great competitive places you want to be. Or you got companies that kind of lost their way on what it took to be competitive and involved government bailouts. And there may not be any sailors in the room, but from 1853 to 1985, the U.S. never lost the America's Cup. Since 1995, we haven't won the America's Cup. Other people adapt. Other people change. They figure out what it takes to be competitive. And that's exactly what we're going to have to do. Now, at this point in time, you may say, well, God dang, it's the Thursday before homecoming, and this guy comes in and wants to depress me, But you need to understand, this is all about what happens with your standard of living. Because when you debate the issue of tax, trade, and others, people say, well, what does that matter? What it matters is it leads to your long-term standard of living. And I tried to get a way to show that. I worked with our economics team. Up the left-hand corner, the World Economic Forum out of Geneva, they issue a country competitiveness code. They look at the country from tax, trade, infrastructure, education, ease of doing business, and they determine its competitiveness. So that's what's plotted on the x-axis. On the y-axis, they also plot GDP per capita, which is an indication of its economic engine, its ability to grow. And so the theory is, if you're more competitive, you have greater growth. And there's somebody in this auditorium today who's taken stat class, and you tell me that we got a high correlation here. So the better your competitiveness, the better your standard of living. And I think that's the debate we need to have as a country. It's not about just trade. It's not about just tax, education, or infrastructure. It gets down to what kind of standard of living do we want to have. So if you buy into the correlation, how does the U.S. look in terms of competitiveness based on the same index from the World Economic Forum? This is the trend that we've had since 2002. And left unaddressed, it will lead to a lower standard of living. And I don't know about you, but that's not what I had in mind in terms of what I'm going to pass on to the next generation. Now, I'm by my nature a fairly optimistic guy. This glass is half full, okay? And so, but as I said in the beginning, I want to get you a little bit on edge and a little bit uncomfortable. Because I think the reality of our society is we've become a little bit too comfortable. And if you want to compete and win on a global scale, that's not, you need a little bit of edge. Now, in terms of the issues I've talked about, I think solutions are out there. On the Reform Tax Code, the one thing that was interesting about the discussion of the Ways and Means is it was one of the few times I've been engaged in the discussion that it was reported on both positively by the Republicans and Democrats. That's not easy to do. The issue of territorial is now in the language of Washington for the first time. But we've got to get to the tax reform, because what that does is levels the playing field, it attracts capital to this country, and that capital leads to jobs and growth. Second, relative to the trade issue, we just got to re-engage. Last night was a big night in terms of getting the 3 free trade agreements passed, but it was only the first step. Third, on infrastructure, we got to remember this issue that if you buy into the fact the road to progress begins to road, period, you also have to buy in declining competitiveness leads with a declining quality of infrastructure. For me, it's a pretty straightforward solution. A highway bill that has a gas tax element to it that leads to consistent reinvestment back into our infrastructure. And then lastly is the education, as I talked about, probably the area that's going to be the most difficult, but the most critical, and that's going to get to reform. It's not a question of more money, it's a question of reforming the way we bring people through the system. Now, I can stand here and talk about this, and then I can go back to my office in Peoria or wherever I may be traveling and say that it's somebody else's job to take care of it. But at the end of the day, that'd be the definition of a hypocrite. So, as an individual or as a company, we have a major stake in what it takes to really turn this around. And we are actively engaged. I spend as much time in Washington as I do, any one of our plants, that's for sure. We are actively engaged in both houses, with Treasury, talking about what it takes to be competitive. We're engaged in the business community, interviews. We have a political action group, speakers bureau to educate our own employees, heavily involved in supporting education through the Caterpillar Foundation. And the last one's the most important. We continue as a company to invest in this country. We'll invest about $3 billion in capital this year. $1.5 billion of that's going to come in the U.S. because we refuse to believe that over the long haul we can't compete and win from a strong U.S. base. But my message to you is you got a role in this as well. If you're not up to speed on these critical issues, if you're not thinking about your competitiveness relative to the rest of the world, I'm telling you, you're missing it, because your job's a lot harder than mine. What you're going to have to compete with to win. Now, as I described in the videos, 1979 was a heck of a lot easier than it is now, but I tell you, now's a lot more fun. Competition's good. But you're going to have to get up to speed on the issues. I'd ask you to get engaged in the political process. But as you do that, understand the issues. If somebody only wants to debate Republican versus Democrat, I'm sorry. They're not who we want to put in office. When somebody wants to debate the issues around competitiveness, what it takes to grow this economy, that's where we ought to be putting our support. Build it into your education. I'm going to give you a couple ideas here in terms of at least suggestions on how you do it. Volunteer. I sit on the board of Junior Achievement USA and worldwide, where you go into classrooms and try to have an impact on kids. And I've seen the impact of college students that volunteer in the classroom and young kids. Most studies would indicate that a kid between the 5th and 6th grade is going to determine, at about that age, what path he's going to take. And trust me, they can relate far better to you as a college student being something within their reach than they relate to an old guy from Caterpillar. So give back to your community and volunteer. And then the last one, don't give up. We're not the first generation that had to deal with tough issues in this country. I mean, there's been generations that gone before us that dealt with, the Great Depression, World Wars, and everything else. This just happens to be our time to determine, are we going to pick up the cause, and are we going to get back to being as competitive as we need to be? In terms of the education, the thing I'd challenge you to do, read these 2 books. Like I said, I'm a Mizzou grad who comes back because I have a great support for a great dean and a college that I absolutely love. These are the real professionals. But take it, the battle, the fight between free enterprise and big government will shape America's future. And then if you haven't read Thomas Friedman, he's my favorite author. And this book has just been released, That Used to Be Us. My favorite line in the book is he says something along the lines of the fact, it's not about us being more like China, it's getting us back to who we used to be. And we do that, and there are great possibilities. Don't underestimate the foundation the U.S. has to be globally competitive. There's a sense of entrepreneurialism, a sense of free thinking, a sense of free flow of information that doesn't exist in a lot of other societies around the world. We have a great foundation to work from. In fact, at Caterpillar, we take great foundations and we rebuild them. Now, this is a true story. This old tractor is a D6R. We had one of our customers that contacted us and said, can you help me with the process of scrapping this old machine? And we said to him, we actually rebuild old machines. We can rebuild the engine, frame's probably still good. There's no reason to scrap it. And this is what that D6R looks like today. The same opportunities exist for us in terms of U.S. competitiveness. But you can't be a bystander as we do that. Napoleon once said that a leader is a dealer in hope. And what I hope I've been able to do today is, as I said earlier, get you a bit uncomfortable with where we are, but stir that competitive spirit relative to what we can be. Because I hope you're like me, and the last thing I want to do is pass on to the next generation of Mizzou grads, or the next generation in terms of my family, an economy and a country that's not competitive. So let's step up. All right? With that, I'll open it up to any questions you may have, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Yes, sir.
Hello, Mr. Rapp. My name is Ryan Strumpf, and I'm a freshman in the Cornell Leadership Program. My question is, you mentioned earlier that the United States needs to move to a territorial tax system. What steps does the government need to take in order to achieve that?
Yeah, it's not going to be easy. I think the first step is going to be leadership. If you go back and look at the history of the United States and any meaningful tax reform, it has only happened in periods when the president was the sponsor of it. The last example was 1986 when Reagan stepped up, and so that was a classic. So that's the first step we're going to have to take. The second one we have to do is we have to look at the realities of the scoring system that we use. I don't know if you guys study this or not, but the realities of the U.S. today, the Treasury Department, if they look at a change from one tax structure to the next, they look at the change in revenue without assuming any change in growth. So they assume if you get to a more competitive tax structure, it's just a loss of revenue. They don't give any consideration in terms of growth. So I think that's the second. The third one, and why I wanted to bring this topic to this group, is we got to get our voice out and understood that says we want to address these issues and increase our competitiveness. Don't underestimate the power of writing to your congressman or engaging in the political process. I don't know how many times in my engagement on Capitol Hill when I've had, congressmen, senators say, Ed, I buy into all that, but I can't get elected on that platform. So, I think if you go back to Declaration of Independence, doesn't it start with we the people? Okay, that's how change happens in this country. And I think the most important ingredient of those three steps is for us to engage and say that's what we want. That's what needs to be to happen in terms of getting us competitive. Okay? It won't be easy, but if it was easy, anybody could do it. All right? First of all, you guys can slip your jackets off. I mean, I know it's got to be warm in here. Yeah. Yes?
Mr. Rapp, good afternoon. Thanks for being with us. I think you and I and a whole lot of people probably see eye to eye on the issues in the competitive equation of education and infrastructure. I totally agree with you there, but I'm concerned about a couple of the assumptions and the consequences of your suggestions on lowering the corporate tax rate and increasing free trade. Particularly if we're lowering the corporate tax rate, where are the additional revenues going to come from to fund our increased investment in education infrastructure? And looking at Caterpillar's recent history over the last 4 years of pre-tax income of $0.5 to up to $5 billion, your effective tax rate was something like 30 to negative 40% one particularly odd year, whereas the global average effective tax rate is something like 25%. In the U.S., it's about 26%, not a big difference there on a competitive stance. We can also talk about the value-added tax in other countries.
Yeah.
And then on the free trade side, again, if we're reducing government revenue, how are we going to pay for investments in education infrastructure? And then that's it.
Yeah, and to me, it gets down to the issue of, do you think you can cost cut yourself to success, or do you have to generate growth to get it? I mean, if you look at the U.S. taxes, the numbers are, statutory rate is 35% federal, on average about 4% state, total 39. And if you look at the other OECD countries, that number is 25. And then if you look at the effective tax rates, which is what you actually pay in the U.S., because people make money overseas, it's about 28. In fact, our effective tax rate this year is going to be 28%. If you remember, 2009 was the absolute financial crisis, and that took everybody's down. And the rest of the world's about 22. Reality of it is today, with those kinds of tax rate differences, capital is going to go where it can get the greatest return. Capital is mobile in a global society. So if you're a company looking to invest around the world with those kinds of differences, do you invest in the U.S., where you've got a 1.6% GDP growth rate over the last 10 years, or do you go down the road and invest in Brazil, India, or China? Now, we can keep our high tax rates, but we've got to accept the fact that if we do that, we're going to continue with about 1.6% growth rate. And if you look at what generates tax revenue, it's growth. You cannot cost cut yourself to success. On the trade issue, you saw the numbers. We have a positive trade balance with those countries that we have free trade agreements. I tell you, one of the things that I'd never underestimate is the ability of U.S. companies, the ability of U.S. people to compete and win around the world. You give them a level playing field, and they can do it. And you see it from, take Caterpillar out of the equation, Boeing, Deere, GE, and others. But if you can't trade in a free and open way across that spectrum, you're not going to get the growth. So, in my mind, how do you get money for investment? You generate the growth. The other opportunity you have on infrastructure, in 2009, you talked about the decline in terms of 2009. As a company, we went from $51 billion in sales in 2008 to $32 billion in 2009 as we went through the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. The largest year-over-year decline in sales in our company history dating back to 1925. But it was our second highest year of investment in R&D in the company history. Because we understood that if we didn't invest in ways that impacted our long-term competitiveness, we weren't going to compete and win down the road. And as we talked about earlier, midpoint of our outlook this year, $32 billion in 2009, $42 billion in 2010, $55 billion this year, because we made the tough decisions and the tough investments. The other place where it comes from, how much waste do you think exists in government today? I mean, on the Bucyrus transaction, the big debate was it going to be the Department of Justice that approved it or the Federal Trade Commission?